This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen, your host. Since 2010, we've been broadcasting sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, we spotlight diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world. I invite you to listen and change how you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where we are exploring world happiness and reporting on life satisfaction and well-being. My guest today is Dr. Lara Aknin. She is a distinguished professor of social psychology at Simon Fraser University and a co-editor of the World Happiness Report. Her research interests lie at the intersection of social psychology, positive psychology, economics, and judgment and decision-making. Her research questions often include the study of what makes people happy, the emotional consequences of kind or generous behavior, and the well-being outcomes of specific spending choices. Welcome, Lara. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I am super excited to go back to basics, at least for this show. You know, the origins of positive psychology, early research that was done. I think we were talking about 2008 was the original Gallup poll. So talk a little bit about the latest report, which does draw on information on data from that early report.
Certainly. So I'm a co-editor of the World Happiness Report, which is a report that has come out every year for the past 11, 12 years or so, with a few gaps in between. It was inspired by a meeting at the United Nations and a call for action to focus on not just how countries are doing in terms of their GDP per capita, but to consider other bigger, broader metrics that might capture how people are doing, how they're living their lives, and so on, and kind of inspired by Bhutan and their pursuit of gross national happiness. And now we are over 10 reports in, and the heart of each year's report is really to try to understand how people report their lives as they live them. And so each issue of the World Happiness Report kind of focuses on a different theme. This year's theme was happiness across the ages or across the life spectrum, and we can get into that in just a second. But perhaps, and each issue kind of covers interesting new findings on those themes. But the heart of every report is chapter 2, where John Helliwell, a fellow editor, one of the founding editors, and his authorship team kind of explore the global happiness rankings as reported by people living in over 130 countries around the globe. And so this year, the theme of the report was on happiness across the life spectrum, and it kind of garnered a lot of attention because, typically across the lifespan, we see that people are quite happy in their younger years, in their teens and young adulthood. People report on average around the globe, we're talking here, some relatively high levels of happiness. Happiness tends, or life satisfaction tends to dip through midlife as people kind of reach this midpoint in their 40s or so, as many people are caring for children, but also perhaps parents who are aging. And then as people kind of and the stresses of work for many people who are in the peak of their careers or reaching there. And then people return or climb as they go through their 50s, 60s, and into their 70s and 80s. This has been a global trend observable in many data sets for quite some time, but this year's report kind of shone a spotlight on some striking data coming particularly from North America, Canada, and the United States, as well as New Zealand and Australia, showing that this trend had kind of disappeared, such that youth or younger adults in many of these places were reporting some of the lowest levels of life satisfaction we had seen in quite some time. And so instead of this typical U shape, it was almost an upward slope with young adults reporting some of the lowest levels of life satisfaction.
Wow. So lower than the midlifers.
Lower than the midlife and certainly lower than the oldest adults.
Wow. That is shocking. Because that U-curve study has kind of been the standard for many years. And is that a result of the pandemic or other influences?
It's hard to pinpoint exactly because this curve, the change. So first and foremost, I should say that the deviation from the U-curve, this new upward slope that we kind of saw primarily in North America and New Zealand and Australia, was not seen everywhere. So there were other parts of the world where the U-curve did remain. And so it seems especially striking in some places of the world and especially in Canada and the United States. The deviation from this U-curve is quite striking. But it's hard to pinpoint exactly whether whether we can tease it apart from COVID, because COVID happened to have co-occurred. But COVID was, by and large, it was a global phenomenon, right? It was a pandemic that impacted the world all over. And so it seems that it is not just COVID specific. It might be, or at least it might be how several of these countries handled their responses to COVID, which was particularly problematic and stressful, and led to lower levels of well-being or life satisfaction among the young.
And I wonder also, so COVID, possibly social media exposure or digital device use, which might be more prevalent in some countries than others?
That is certainly one explanation. It's not the only one. Haifeng Huang, who is one of the contributors to chapter 2, did some, early investigations into this. I mean, the Gallup World Poll data is incredibly rich and incredibly large, and provides nationally representative samples of the globe. And so it's an incredible resource. That being said, we're asking about 4 countries in particular and a relatively limited age span. And so it's hard. The survey was not designed to drill down in these specific areas in advance. That being said, Haifeng conducted some really early analyses trying to understand what's different between young adults in these regions, the North American regions in particular, now as opposed to where they were a decade or so ago, where this U trend was still present. And it seems like there are a number of stressors that are now being reported by younger adults in North America. Some of it has to do with a frustration around or trust in democracy and government. Some of it has to do with lower satisfaction of one's living arrangements and kind of expectations of what is to come. And others have to do with a lower report of social connection. So or objectively felt social connection. And so while actually objective amounts of social connection have not deviated much from what it used to be about 15 years ago, people are reporting, if I remember that right, lower levels of social connection than adults of this age group did about 15 years ago.
So let's talk for a moment about the happiest countries, because that's always an interesting revelation. Has that changed?
Not in any drastic fashion. So over the last several years, the World Happiness Report has really been showcasing some incredible strengths, or at least by self-reported measures, in the Scandinavian countries. So Finland remains number 1, with a number of kind of other Nordic countries up there with it. Part of it is a very real finding in these countries. And I think part of it has to do with how the data are collected. So every year, the national rankings based on life satisfaction are grouped across 3-year averages to get more reliable estimates. And so it would take a whopping drastic change for a country to skyrocket to the top or drop to the bottom, because the rankings are built on 3-year averages. But beyond that, I think it has to do with life evaluations tend to be relatively stable. They're designed, this metric is not supposed to bounce around from moment to moment. It's, supposed to be a generally stable phenomenon. And so these findings are not jumping all over the map. The Nordic countries have been at the top and remain near the top in most places. That being said, there were some striking deviations. This year, for one of the first times, I think ever, the United States dropped out of the top 20. And so, for instance, that captured a lot of attention. And that drop was driven significantly by the life satisfaction ratings of the young.
Yeah. That is fascinating. Not surprising, based upon where we're both sitting, but very, very interesting. It's funny, you mentioned the name John Helliwell, and I want to say that he was one of the first guests on this show.
Wonderful.
When we started in 2011. Isn't that funny?
That is funny and fitting. He is very generous with his time and extremely knowledgeable. Was he on to talk about the World Happiness Report?
Yes.
Okay.
We worked on a different project together. That's how we met.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, I'm starting this podcast. Would you be willing to come on? And he goes, I would love to. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear his name.
Yes, he is a lovely person and a huge driving force of the World Happiness Report every year. So I'm glad he's been on, and he's always one of the most knowledgeable to talk about Chapter 2 because that is his baby.
We should probably have him come on again. I need to reach out to him. But this brings me to a word that you use to describe John Helliwell, which is generous with his time. And this comes right into your wheelhouse where your research has been significant. So I'd love to just kind of introduce that concept, then take a break and come back.
Sure.
So generosity.
Yeah. So I think so. There are so many reasons I'm interested in generosity, but I think it's one of the most primary ways that we show that we have care and concern for other people. We can get into this through the World Happiness Report data or through so many different avenues of research. But I think other people are some of our greatest sources of happiness. And so the ways that we build and maintain those social relationships are kind of critical for understanding what can bring about greater well-being. And so I've been deeply interested in how people express their care and concern for others, primarily through financial questions of generosity. And I've been studying this since 2008. Separate from John, I mean, I did my graduate studies at the University of British Columbia, which is where John was. And so some of our early work was looking at this in experimental studies, and I'm happy to talk about those. But when I met John, we started asking some of these questions using the Gallup World Poll data. And we have found, and John has found and reported in the World Happiness Report on multiple occasions, that donations to charity is one of the top, what we call donations and donations to charity is one of the top predictors of life satisfaction around the globe. And it's pretty consistent when we look at both life satisfaction, but also when we look at positive affect levels as well. And so it seems to be, and I can dive into this in more detail after the break, but it seems to be a relatively universal phenomenon that most people around the globe feel good when they use their financial resources to help others.
Giving is the gift that keeps on giving, right? It does more than just help somebody else. What it does to us within ourselves and how we feel about life and ourselves. I think that's the preciousness in this part of the conversation. Let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll continue the conversation with Dr. Lara Aknin. We're talking about World Happiness, reporting on life satisfaction and subjective well-being. To learn more, you can go to sfu.ca, go to the psychology department, and check out Dr. Lara Aknin, and that's Aknin. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back. Harvesting Happiness is rooted in science. Our work facilitates applied positive psychology practices through media and consulting. We're committed to sound ideas for better well-being, leading to increased life satisfaction and a better world for everyone. We're not into pseudoscience or quick fixes. We're focused on common sense backed by rigorous research. Healthy critical thinking is the foundation for our discussions. We encourage you to challenge preconceptions and explore ideas with a curiously discerning mind. Collaboration with our guests is united by an inclusive vision to boost resilience, critical thinking, communication, and problem solving through civilized discourse and pleasurable relational engagement for everyone. Each day, we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstances. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please seek support because good psychological health is vital to the achievement of a healthy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial and educational services that boost emotional and social intelligence. And we're back continuing the conversation with Lara Aknin. We're talking about World Happiness, reporting on life satisfaction and well-being. Let's get back to it. So Lara, let's go back to generosity and its benefits, the rewards that we feel when we are being generous with others, as well as the recipient also feels a little bit of a spike in their own happiness.
Yeah, certainly. So this is a question I've been examining since my days in graduate school and something I spend a lot of my time thinking about. And yeah, I'm curious about the facts, and I think it's a beautiful complexity of human behavior that we feel good on average on most occasions when we help others. Our early work on this topic started when I was doing my graduate work with Elizabeth Dunn at the University of British Columbia. And we wanted to know whether spending small amounts of money on others would lead to higher levels of happiness than spending on oneself. And our first experiment was really straightforward. It involved me going out in the morning hours on campus, recruiting undergraduates who were going about their day, and inviting them to take part in a study on everyday spending habits. And if they agreed, I dug into my backpack and pulled out an envelope, and they were randomly assigned to receive either a $5 or $20 bill inside the envelope, along with a slip of paper that had some spending instructions. And the spending instructions either asked them to spend the money on a gift for someone else or a donation to charity, so what we called our pro-social spending or generous spending, or to spend the money on a bill or expense or gift for themselves. And importantly, we told everyone to spend the money by 5 p.m. that day so that a research assistant who didn't know how much money they received or what their spending instructions were could call them in the evening to ask them a couple questions. And the key questions in the evening were how happy they felt. And what we found was that regardless of how much money people spent, those who were randomly assigned to spend on others were significantly happier at the end of the day. And so this kind of coupled with a number of other studies led us to conclude that spending money on others can promote happiness or higher levels of happiness than we get from spending on ourselves. And so that was kind of the early work. And from there, we kind of tried to, a lot of my career has been trying to push the boundaries and understand, is this something that's limited to a sample of relatively privileged undergraduate students in North America? Or is this something that is deeper, perhaps more common of our humanity? And so through my dissertation work, we partnered with collaborators in India and South Africa and Uganda to try to test this question in relatively rich and poor countries. Might we also see these emotional rewards of small acts of financial generosity? And the long story short is that yes, we did. So although the details of how people give gifts or spend money on others in ways that show they care varies a lot by culture, the emotional rewards seem to be quite consistent across cultures.
This is wonderful. And it makes me think of a couple of really standout moments that I've experienced. I was once going to a concert and I was parking the car and the person in front of me paid my parking, which immediately inspired me to pay for the parking for the person behind me, quickly park the car and try and find the person who had paid for my parking in the lot, which I was unable to do. But I did have that experience of extreme elevation. It was really wonderful. And then the other is, going the coffee line, right? Where somebody buys you the coffee or you buy the coffee for somebody else. And we're not talking large amounts of money, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I mean, that's so lovely. I mean, I love hearing about these everyday acts of generosity because I think sometimes we get in our heads that these acts of generosity need to be monumental. We need to donate a library. We need to, to have our names on a wall or something of that sort. But I think a lot of the beauty of this behavior is just that they're everyday forms of kindness that don't need to be expensive. I mean, in some of our studies, in the early work, it was $5 or $20. But since, we've been trying to consistent with the changing norms in psychology and the higher standards of evidence now than there were, a decade ago, we've now been running hundreds of participants through studies. And so we've had to, due to the limitations of grants, use smaller amounts of money. And we see that even when people are giving, around $1 or $2.50, they're feeling good about giving. And so it's not so much about like the size of the gift, but sometimes about whether you feel like you're making an impact and if you have an opportunity to connect with others and show you care. And so it needn't be large and substantial to kind of reap these emotional rewards.
Does your research indicate if the money is given anonymously or if there's a direct connection, if there's a difference in the donor's response?
A bit. So we have some early work kind of probing this question a bit. And we find that, here, I'll explain the study. We ran this one study in a classroom where half of the students were randomly selected to be givers. The other half were randomly selected to be recipients. And the givers were given a flat sum of $10 and told that they could choose as much or as little as they wanted to give. The givers who half were told that they had to make the donation in person, they had to go walk over and choose to give their donation to the recipient. And the other half were told that if they could decide again how much they wanted to give, but someone else would be their deliverer that would carry the funds over. Interestingly, we thought that people would give more money when their face and name were associated with the act of giving than when the donation was anonymous. And that wasn't the case. Actually, on average, people gave across those two conditions similar amounts. And to our surprise, we found that people reported more emotional reward from giving higher amounts of money when they were giving with their identity attached as opposed to anonymously. And part of that might be because when people went to give larger sums in person, I think there was this opportunity to connect with, giving in person has the opportunity to foster this connection. And so when you're face to face and you're acting generously, it's a kind gesture and people appreciate it. But if people know that you've chosen to give $1 and keep 9 for yourself, that might not be the most comfortable exchange. Meanwhile, in the anonymous condition where people still had $10, they got to decide how much, if any, they wanted to give away. On average, the donation amounts didn't differ, but they didn't get to see the emotional rewards of the recipient, nor did they get to kind of build this positive, perhaps, relationship with the recipient when they gave a lot. And so I think it's hard to disentangle. I could speak more on this if you like, but over the years, we've kind of tried to figure out when giving is especially rewarding. And I think this study kind of taps into a few of the important factors and what's present and what might be absent. We find that giving is most rewarding when it provides an opportunity to connect with others. And so I think the anonymous donation condition lacked that. They didn't get to connect with the other person because they didn't get to see them. We also find that giving is especially rewarding when people feel like they've had a choice to give. Here, everybody had the choice, so I don't think that's responsible for these differences. And finally, people feel particularly good about giving or giving more when they feel like they've had a positive impact. And so I think when you give face to face, oftentimes you can see the positive impact you've had. When you're giving anonymously, it doesn't always need to be decoupled from seeing the impact, but in that situation, it was.
What are some ways that people can give when they don't have a lot of money? Some people, not everybody has an extra $5 or $3 to give. What are some simple ways where we can have that that elevation by giving and not necessarily spend a lot?
That's a great question. So, I mean, as you point out, as part of the question, we don't find that giving financially needs to be especially large to feel good about giving. As little as a few dollars can make a difference for the giver, and also feels nice for the recipient too when people feel like it's a symbol of care and concern. But I started studying financial generosity as just one form of generosity that is out there. I think people have a number of ways they can show and give of themselves to other people. And I think finances, there's one of them, but I think people can also give their time. They can give their advice. They can give their blood. They can share their food. They can give organs. People can be incredibly generous in creative ways. And so although I think the literature on financial generosity has proliferated most quickly, in part because it's one resource that we as researchers can give to participants to give away and then watch and see what happens. We can't make people give blood. We can't make people give organs.
Good point.
Even the time stuff is a little bit more challenging than you might think. But I think generally speaking, the evidence is quite consistent. There are hundreds of studies that show that, for instance, people who volunteer their time and people who volunteer more of their time report higher levels of happiness. The experimental evidence is still, I think, relatively underdeveloped, but I think there's food sharing evidence that people who share their food, people who share their advice, all of these I tend to think of as kind of various forms of generosity that, people have these resources that they can give and share to others.
The research done on volunteerism that was done long ago by Dr. Christopher Peterson, who is at the University of Michigan, who has since passed, sadly, but he has done a lot on the helper's high. Like how good we feel when we do something good for somebody else, whether it's like the temporary suspension of our own ego or putting our needs aside. Like it's pretty hard to be depressed or saddened if you're doing something for somebody else, at least for that moment.
Right. Yeah. And I think part of it is that, some research in a kind of adjacent but closely related areas that when we have capacity to give to others, we realize that we ourselves may not be deficient. So there's a wonderful study by Zoe Chance, Mike Norton, and I'm sure there were other authors on the paper too, showing that when people give their time, they feel as if they have more time. And so, when we are capable of giving a resource, when we're capable of doing things for others, we, at least perhaps in that moment, in that short term, might not think of ourselves as lacking, but capable and competent and able to give.
And I'm wondering also about feeling as though we're empowered in our lives, right? With so many factors, external factors making us feel as though we actually don't have choices in this way. I mean, I don't have the answer. You're the researcher, but I'm just thinking out loud that maybe we do feel very empowered in that moment.
I do think, I think it's not the terminology I used before, but I was talking about those, kind of 3 key ingredients that help us understand when giving is emotionally rewarding. And I think part of it is this sense of, I called it impact, but I think researchers in the self-determination theory space would very much call it a sense of competence, a sense of autonomy and efficacy are all kind of bundled in here. And so when we're helping others, we feel like, hopefully we feel like we're the drivers of this act, and we feel like we're imparting a significant, meaningful change on other people. And that might be when we're most likely to feel good about giving.
We are out of time, which saddens me temporarily only. I'm hopeful that you'll come back and we're going to talk more about the World Happiness Report, other studies that are sort of out there in the world right now, because happiness is one of those emotions that we all recognize when we experience it, right? And it's so precious and to be savored. And how do we get more of it, especially in complicated times? So
I'd love to come back.
Yeah.
And
I think
back. Yay. I'd love to.
My guest today is Dr. Lara Aknin. And to learn more, you can go to sfu.ca, go to the psychology department, and put into that search bar, Lara Aknin. Thank you, Lara.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guest, Lara Aknin, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day, and remember to be kind to one another. Want to explore more sound ideas for better well-being? Check out our new bonus edition content at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by Lisa Cypers Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the excellent team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.